Hey guys, welcome back to my channel. So today I'm going to be doing a every single movie I watched this year type of video. And hold on, I'm gonna get a pillow to sit on. Okay, so yeah, sorry. Okay, there we go. Okay, so I have all the movies on my letterbox, and I took a picture of them all, and I'm gonna be talking about all of them. So the first one is I watched Ghost World, and then I watched Moonstruck, which I really liked it. It was a beautiful romance film. And then I watched Little Women, and then I watched Dazed and Confused, and then I watched Nosferatu the Vampire. I think it was a film in 73, but I'm not sure. Um, and then I watched Sabrina with Audrey Hepburn, and then I watched, hold on, can't see. And then I watched The Boy in the Plastic Bubble, and then I watched Good Will Hunting. I love that movie. Honestly, it's a perfect film for the fall. And then I watched Uptown Girls, and then I watched Surf's Up, and then I watched 2 Weeks Notice, and then Warm Bodies, The Water Boy, Grease, The Princess Diaries. I watched the second Princess Diaries, so Princess Diaries 2, and then I saw Paddington in Peru, and I saw that with my brother. And then I watched Dr. Dolittle, and then I watched this by myself, but I watched Mickey 17, and then I saw Lilo and Stitch, and then I saw Princess and the Frog, and then I watched Iron Man, and then I watched Kung Fu Panda, and then I watched Mirror Mirror, and then I watched Pirates of the Caribbean. I'm not sure which one. I think it was the first one, I think. I'm not sure. Um, and then I watched The Last Holiday. And then I watched Brighter Days. It was Ariana Grande's little short film for her album that came out. And then I watched The Life List. And then I watched Brave. And then I watched 101 Dalmatians, and I watched that film in French but with English subtitles. And then I watched Night in the Museum. I watched that with my family in our living room. It was so fun. And then I watched Mary Poppins, and then I watched My Girl, and then I watched Amelie, and then I watched Violet Evergarden the movie, and then I watched The Valet, and then I watched this one is these are a French film. I watched The Valet, I watched La Berge Espagnole, and then I watched Russian Dolls, I think that says. And then I watched Pride and Prejudice, and then I watched Love Me If You Dare, and then I watched The Class, and then I watched Alice in Wonderland, and then I watched Priceless, and then I watched Micmacs, and then I watched Lilo and Stitch, but the live action version, and then I watched What a Girl Wants, and then I watched High School Musical 2, and then I watched My Neighbor is Totoro, and then I watched The Page Master, and then I watched Cinema Paradiso, and then I watched Matilda, and then I watched How to Train Your Dragon, the live action version, and then I watched Clue, and then I watched Howl's Moving Castle, and then I watched Elio in the theater, and then I watched Past Lives, and then I watched Halloween Town, and then I watched E.T., and then I watched Superman, and then I watched Moonrise Kingdom, and I really, really liked that one. And then I watched Northanger Abbey, and then I watched Pink Panther, and then I watched Edward Scissorhands, and then I watched City of Bones, Memorial Instruments, and then I watched How to Train Your Dragon, the animation, and then I watched Good Witch, and then I watched Good Witch, The Good Witch's Garden, and then I watched Tinkerbell, The Never Beast, and then I watched Stardust, and then I watched Paranorman, and then I watched The Crow, and then I watched Remember the Titans, and then I watched Go vs. Monster, and then I watched Winnie the Pooh, and then I watched The Princess Bride, and then I watched Frankenweenie, and then I watched Geek Charming, and then I watched The Grinch, How to Steal Christmas with. I watched that with my parents in the theater for the 25th anniversary, and then I watched The Holiday, and then I watched Nosferatu, the new one that just came out, and then I watched SpongeBob Christmas, and then I watched The Miser Brothers Christmas, and then I watched Frosty's Winter Wonderland, and then I watched Marty Supreme yesterday, actually, and then I watched The Incredible Hulk. So those are all the movies that I watched this year. I hope you guys enjoyed this video. I know this was like a short kind of video, but I hope you guys enjoyed that, and make sure to like and please subscribe to my channel. So yeah, thank you so much. Bye.